Imagine it's the early days of the United States, a fledgling nation fresh from the triumph of the Revolutionary War with Great Britain. In the halls of the newly established government, two minds clashed, setting the stage for the birth of America's political party system. On the one side was Alexander Hamilton, the first Secretary of the Treasury. Dashing and eloquent, Hamilton envisioned a strong central government powering a nation built on industry and commerce. He believed in a flexible interpretation of the Constitution, one that allowed for a robust executive branch. On the other was Thomas Jefferson, the first Secretary of State. A thinker and philosopher, Jefferson dreamed of an America grounded in agriculture, where common individuals thrived under the aegis of limited government. He championed a strict interpretation of the Constitution, ensuring the federal government stayed within its prescribed bounds. Their debates were epic. In cabinet meetings under President George Washington, sparks flew. Hamilton's proposal for a national bank was a flashpoint. He saw it as vital for economic stability. Jefferson decried it as a step towards monarchy. This wasn't just a personal feud, it was a battle for the soul of the nation. Their followers rallied behind them, giving rise to two factions. The Federalists, Hamilton's camp, pushed for a strong national government. Meanwhile, the Democratic-Republicans, led by Jefferson and James Madison, fought for states' rights and a more decentralized federal structure. This rivalry did more than just shape policy. It fundamentally transformed American politics. It gave birth to the country's first political parties, setting precedents for political organization, campaigning, and public discourse. The Federalists and the Democratic-Republicans were the forebearers of the complex party system we see in the United States today. As we delve into the evolution of this system, remember it all began with two individuals, a room, and a vision for what America could be. Thus, even though they're not mentioned in the Constitution, political parties in the United States emerged very early in its history. While many of the founders were distrustful of political factions, warning they could lead to domestic factionalism and divisions, nevertheless, the debate over ratification of the Constitution resulted in two distinct sides emerging. On the one hand, the Federalists argued in favor of the new Constitution, supporting a strong central government, a robust executive branch, and policies that generally favored banking, commercial interests, and closer ties with Britain. On the other hand, the Anti-Federalists raised concerns about the new Constitution, arguing in favor of stronger state governments and a more agrarian, decentralized republic. They were wary of a strong central government, emphasizing the need for civic virtue and fearing the encroachment of tyranny. And as the new government began to operate, these two factions evolved into the first political parties in the United States. The Federalists were led by Alexander Hamilton and John Adams. The Anti-Federalists would ultimately rebrand themselves as the Democratic-Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and, ironically, James Madison, ironically because Madison was one of the leading authors of the Federalist Papers during the ratification debate. After the Adams presidency, the Democratic-Republicans would take control of the national government. After Washington, who served 2 terms as the only nonpartisan or independent president, John Adams was elected to a single term as a Federalist. After that, several successive waves of elections were won by the Democratic-Republicans, with Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe each serving 2 successive terms, and John Quincy Adams serving a single term, all as Democratic-Republicans. The dominance of the Democratic-Republicans after the Adams presidency was the result of shifting public perceptions, casting the Federalists as too elitist to understand the plight of the average American, too beholden to commercial and banking interests, and, especially after the War of 1812, too close to Britain. But even among the political disagreements between the parties, the levels of partisanship were minimal, and politics was largely about the individual, not the party during the first party system. By 1828, the Federalists had largely disappeared from the national scene, and the Democratic-Republicans were witnessing increasing internal divisions, paving the way for the second-party system. After the election of 1828, the Democratic Party, which emerged out of Jefferson's Democratic-Republicans, had largely coalesced around the leadership of Andrew Jackson, who decisively won the 1828 election, carrying more than 55% of the national popular vote and vanquishing the Federalists into the political wilderness. In their place, the Whig Party would emerge, drawing former Federalists as well as disaffected members of the Democratic-Republicans who opposed Jackson, members of the populist Anti-Mason Party, and others. The Whigs emphasized the power of the Congress over the executive branch, supporting policies of economic modernization and protectionism. By contrast, the Democratic-Republicans, now recast as the Democratic Party, emphasized the primacy of the executive branch, which they controlled, and a powerful populist agenda prioritizing individual and states' rights, all the while styling themselves as the party of the common man. The second party system was characterized by a strong Democratic Party, with Presidents Jackson, Van Buren, Polk, and Pierce all being members of the party, and a more fractured Whig Party. William Henry Harrison was elected as a Whig in 1840, but died of pneumonia less than a month into office. His vice president, John Tyler, assumed the presidency, but was actually expelled from the Whig Party while in office due to policy disagreements. Zachary Taylor was also elected to the presidency as a Whig, though he died while in office about a year and a half after assuming the position. The diversity of the Whig Party proved to be a weakness, and the party struggled with sharp internal divisions, particularly over slavery, eventually disintegrating after the election of 1852. But the second party system nevertheless set the stage for the contemporary American political system, introducing the idea of party identity among common people. Indeed, Andrew Jackson regularly hosted barbecues with the aim of cultivating a national network of affiliates and encouraging people not just to vote for the party, but to identify with it. And with that, there were innovations in political campaigns, including greater use of parades, slogans, posters, and events designed to rally supporters and sway public opinion. The era was also defined by the increasing power of the political parties themselves, particularly through their use of the spoils system, under which loyal party members and allies were rewarded with appointments in government positions after their own side won the election. But by the 1850s, the issue of slavery was increasingly occupying center stage on the national agenda. The Whig Party's attempt to straddle the issue and maintain its uneasy alliance between the so-called conscientious Whigs in the North who opposed slavery on moral and political grounds, and the so-called Cotton Whigs in the South who supported the institution of slavery. The inability of party leadership to find a unifying stand on the issue and its attempt to straddle this middle ground led to a loss of support from both the anti-slavery elements in the North and the pro-slavery elements in the South, ultimately leading many Whigs to seek new political affiliations in other emerging parties. Many former Whigs found support in a newly created Republican Party, which positioned itself in opposition to the Democratic Party. The Republican Party carried over many of the policies of the Whig Party, including support for national banks and railroads, high tariffs, homesteading, and aid to land-grant colleges. But it also took a clear stance opposing slavery. The Democratic Party, by contrast, maintained a more conservative and agrarian orientation, emphasizing states' rights and drawing most of its support from the southern states. During the third-party system, the Republican Party was generally dominant, particularly in the aftermath of the Civil War and during Reconstruction. After James Buchanan's term ended, Republicans controlled the presidency from 1861 until Grover Cleveland's election in 1885, with the exception of President Andrew Jackson, who was officially a member of the National Union Party, a temporary political party that brought Republicans and Democrats together during the Civil War. But after the war's conclusion, Democrats faced internal divisions and were often associated with the former Confederacy, making their national electoral successes less frequent until the end of the period. But even as they were divided, the Democrats dominated the southern states and maintained strong positions in Congress, often controlling one or both chambers. Indeed, Democrats' control of the southern states was so strong that the region was often referred to as the Solid South. This was part of a broader pattern that began to emerge in the third-party system, in which regional alignments in national politics began to emerge. The Republican Party was based primarily in the North and Midwest, capitalizing on anti-slavery sentiments and economic modernization. In contrast, the Democratic Party was rooted in the South and among immigrant populations in the North. During this era, we also see issues of cultural, religious, and ethnic identity becoming more prominent, influencing party alliances and voter bases. The spoils system, which had emerged in the second-party system, became entrenched as both Republicans and Democrats engaged in a system of political patronage, where political appointments and benefits were often distributed based on party loyalty rather than merit. And during this period, political campaigns became increasingly organized and sophisticated, with parties using new technologies and strategies to mobilize voters. Campaigns increasingly relied on telegraph and whistle-stop railroad tours to reach out to voters, and the partisan presses, broadsides, and pamphlets to get out their messages. We also see increasing use of visual propaganda, political cartoons, and imagery to criticize opponents and to promote party positions. And we also start to see the first rudimentary use of public opinion sampling and polling to gauge public sentiment and tailor political messages accordingly. The third-party system ended as issues of industrialization, labor rights, and populism came to the fore, leading to the fourth-party system, where the focus shifted more towards these issues and away from Reconstruction and Civil War legacies. The fourth-party system is commonly referred to as the Progressive Era, and is generally considered to have lasted from the mid-1890s to the 1930s. The period was characterized by a realignment of political forces and significant changes in the strategies and policies of the major parties, especially as they responded to the challenges of industrialization, urbanization, and significant social changes. The era saw continued rivalry between the Democratic and Republican parties. Throughout the period, Republicans enjoyed strong support in the northern states and among the growing urban middle class, advocating for policies that were generally pro-business and supporting some progressive policies, especially under President Roosevelt's administration, that focused on consumer protections, breaking up the railroads and other monopolies, and introducing civil service reforms. Democrats, on the other hand, drew most of their support from the southern states and among rural and agrarian interests, advocating for a variety of regulatory and social reforms intended to tame the excesses of industrialization. The Republican Party continued to dominate the fourth-party system, winning every presidential election during the period except that of President Woodrow Wilson. But even Wilson only won because the Republican vote was split between Taft and Teddy Roosevelt, reflecting a growing rift within the Republican Party. The fourth-party system in the United States left several important legacies and had a lasting impact on the nation's political, social, and economic landscape. At the broadest level, the rise of progressivism led to a variety of social, political, and economic reforms, including the establishment of labor laws and women's suffrage, as well as the origins of the regulatory state with a variety of regulatory bodies and laws that aimed to control the excesses of industrial capitalism and set precedent for future governments' roles in regulating the economy. The adoption of the 16th Amendment, which allowed for a federal income tax, reinforced the power of the federal government. With respect to political parties, though, the fourth-party system saw advances in campaign techniques, including the use of emerging mass media technologies, more sophisticated voter mobilization efforts, and the development of modern political consulting. The era's political mobilization and reform, such as the direct election of senators in the 17th Amendment and the expansion of the franchise to women through the 19th Amendment, contributed to increased political participation and further democratization of American politics, though various laws remained in place, particularly in the southern states, intended to prevent blacks and other minorities from voting. The fourth-party system was a transformative period in American politics, marked by the maturation of the political party system, significant social and economic reforms, and the beginnings of the modern regulatory state. It was an era that responded to the challenges and opportunities of a rapidly changing America, setting the stage for the further transformations introduced in the subsequent fifth-party system. The fifth-party system is generally recognized as having started in the 1930s with the election of Franklin Roosevelt and the establishment of the New Deal coalition, and lasting until the 1960s or into the 1980s, depending upon different historical interpretations. The fifth-party system was marked by the resurgence of the Democratic Party under the so-called New Deal coalition, which brought together a diverse group of voters including working-class people, African Americans, urbanites, and rural farmers. Under this new coalition, Democrats increasingly advocated for significant governmental intervention in the economy, social security, labor rights, and infrastructure projects, aiming to address the economic hardships of the Depression and reforming the financial system. The Republican Party maintained its support through business interests and more affluent voters and conservative regions, though it struggled to break the New Deal coalition's hold on the electorate, advocating for less government intervention in the economy and more conservative social policies. In the broader context, these changes centered on the New Deal project enacted to bring the United States out of the Great Depression and dramatically expanding the reach and power of the federal government, as well as the civil rights struggles, particularly during the 1960s, that fundamentally transformed the American political landscape. The Democratic Party enjoyed widespread electoral success at both the presidential and congressional levels for several decades through the fifth party system, largely due to the popularity of the New Deal and Roosevelt's leadership. The most important legacies of the fifth party system centered on Southern realignment. As the Democratic Party increasingly became associated with civil rights and liberal policies, many white conservative Southerners began to shift their allegiances to the Republican Party, a trend that continued into subsequent decades. This shift corresponded with the ideological consolidation of both parties. Campaigns became more professionalized and focused on individual candidates, with emphasis on presidential politics and personality. The rise of television and more sophisticated forms of communication and advertising changed the ways parties interacted and engaged with voters. And finally, particularly in the later years of this period, we start to see the beginnings of increased ideological polarization, a trend that would continue into the sixth party system as parties became more ideologically homogeneous and political discourse became more contentious. The fifth party system was a significant period of government expansion, social reform, and political realignment, setting the stage for many of the political divisions and debates that continue to shape American politics, including discussions about the role of government, civil rights, and economic policy that characterize the sixth party system. That system began with the election of Ronald Reagan to the presidency in 1980. During this period, the Republican Party, especially with Reagan's presidency, solidified its position as the party of conservative values, free market capitalism, strong national defense, and limited government. The era saw the consolidation of the Reagan coalition, which included economic conservatives, social conservatives, and foreign policy hawks. The Democratic Party continued to advocate for social welfare programs, environmental protection, and civil rights. However, in response to electoral challenges, it saw the rise of more centrist figures and movements like the New Democrats led by figures like Bill Clinton, who sought to reclaim the political center and respond to calls for reform within welfare and fiscal policies, adopting a neoliberal position that mixed support for free trade and economic liberalization with a supportive welfare state. Since the presidency of George H.W. Bush, political power in the United States has regularly shifted back and forth between Democrats and Republicans, reflecting the relative political parity of the two parties. However, throughout this period, Democrats generally moved towards the center of the political spectrum, adopting more conservative policies, especially in economic and foreign policy areas, to move closer to the Republican position. But even as Democrats adopted a more neoliberal position, both parties became more ideologically homogeneous, with conservatives increasingly aligning with the Republican Party and liberals with the Democratic Party. This sorting contributed to heightened partisanship and less overlap between the parties. Throughout the period, likely as a result of the shift in the Democratic Party's orientation, cultural and social issues increasingly occupied center stage in political debates. Debates over abortion, gun rights, immigration, and later same-sex marriage intensified the political divides between and within the parties, often overshadowing economic issues in political discourse. And throughout the period, the United States continued to become more racially and ethnically diverse, with significant implication for party strategies and voting patterns. Minority parties, especially Hispanic and Asian populations, grew, altering the political landscape. In response, the Democratic Party sought to solidify its support among minorities, young voters, and urban centers, while the Republican Party increased its appeal among white, rural, and ex-urban voters, as well as in older demographics. The advent of cable news and later the internet, social media, and the 24-hour news cycle dramatically changed political campaigning, news dissemination, and voter engagement. This increased political polarization as voters increasingly find themselves in echo chambers that reinforce pre-existing views. And political parties began utilizing more sophisticated data analytics and targeted advertising to identify, persuade, and mobilize voters. Finally, a couple of important institutional and electoral changes occur during this period. First, legal and regulatory changes, including Supreme Court decisions like Citizens United versus FEC, significantly impacted campaign financing, leading to the rise of super PACs and increased campaign spending. Finally, the continued evolution and importance of primaries and caucuses in the presidential nomination process gave more power to the party base, often empowering more ideologically extreme elements within each party and shaping the selection of candidates and leading to more ideologically extreme candidates. The sixth-party system reflected the continuing evolution of American politics in response to changing social, economic, and global conditions. It's marked by sophisticated political operations, deeply entrenched partisan divides, and an electorate that's more polarized yet also more engaged and informed than ever before. But following the election of President Trump in 2016, political scientists began to speculate that a seventh-party system was emerging. There are a few reasons for this. First, Trump's rise to the presidency was marked by a distinctly populist appeal, positioning himself as an outsider to the traditional political establishment. His success suggested an appetite among voters for non-traditional, anti-establishment candidates challenging the norms of the two major parties. There's also been an increasing shift in political party platforms in recent years, as both parties appear increasingly willing to move away from the free trade consensus that defined both parties' platforms through much of the 1990s and early 2000s. In response to the Trump presidency, the Democratic Party also saw a surge in progressive activism, with increased prominence of figures advocating for more substantial government intervention in healthcare, climate policy, and economic inequality. And the party bases for each party appear to be in transition. Suburban women and highly educated voters, that is, voters who have a college degree, were historically reliably Republican, but since the Trump presidency, both groups have shifted towards the Democratic Party. At the same time, Republicans have made inroads in courting minority voters away from the Democratic Party and have seen an increase in support from working-class voters, particularly in the Rust Belt and rural America. On both sides, campaign strategies have shifted away from trying to capture the independent and swing voters and more towards mobilizing their respective political bases to turn out and vote. And this ideological sorting and widening gap between the two parties has led to more political gridlock and partisanship at the national level, and a shift towards governance and policymaking outside of a paralyzed Congress, primarily through executive orders and judicial rulings, as well as at state and local policymaking levels. Now, to be fair, while some have argued that these shifts represent the emergence of a seventh-party system, others contend that they're merely a continuation or intensification of trends within the sixth-party system. The debate is ongoing, and the lasting impact of these contemporary shifts remain to be seen. But that's it for now. Please leave any questions you have in the comments section below, and thanks for watching.